Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new. Today I'm going to be doing my April wrap-up. Now, April was not my best reading month as far as quantity. I only read 4 books in April. However, 2 of the books I really enjoyed. They were like 4, almost 5-star reads, and the other 2 I gave 3 stars. So as far as quality, this was a pretty decent reading month. So, I mean, quality over quantity, I think I did okay. So I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing over the past few months, and that's starting with my least favorite books and working up to my favorite books that I read during the month. But before we get started, I do just want to say that because I'm wearing Marilyn on my shirt, I thought I had to go with the classic Marilyn red lipstick, but that also means that almost definitely there will be lipstick on my teeth at some point, perhaps multiple points during this video. So I just want to apologize in advance if it's happening right now, perhaps, and I don't notice, so I'm sorry. Anyways, now we can jump into the 4 books that I read in April, starting with my least favorite one, which, like I said, was a 3-star read, so it was still, like, a pretty good book, and that is The Duke and I by Julia Quinn. This is obviously the first book in the Bridgerton series. I did a whole reading vlog / review of this book, so all of my thoughts are very much detailed in that video, so I will leave a link to it up in the eye in the corner if you want to learn more about this book. But just to give you a little sum up right here, obviously I gave it 3 stars, so I did enjoy it. It's not a very well written book in my opinion. It has some problematic elements to it which I did not appreciate, but it is a very fun, like, guilty pleasure, easy to read kind of book. I do understand, like, why there is the hype around it. I get, like, why it was turned into a TV show. It has its redeeming qualities in that it's a very just, like, fun book to read. So I gotta give it that, I guess. My next 3-star read is kind of the exact opposite of the last book in that it is not a fun book to read at all, and this is called The Five. This is the untold lives of the 5 women killed by Jack the Ripper. This is obviously a nonfiction book. I listened to it on audio, and I kind of feel like I can't really review this book or give it a proper rating because I had a very difficult time listening to this book. So I just in general have a hard time concentrating on audiobooks, which is why I never read fiction in audio. I only ever read nonfiction because it's a little bit easier for me to follow. But I think I listened to this book in a time in my life where I just had so much going on, and it was nearly impossible for me to just concentrate on anything. So I'm going to be completely honest in saying that at this point, the only story I can remember is the story of the first girl, who I think was called Polly. Everybody else, like, their stories have just, like, slipped out of my mind. I really can't remember them, and so I feel like I can't really properly review or rate this book, so I ended up just giving it a 3-star rating with the idea that at some point I'm going to return to this book and read it in its physical form, because I do think this is a really good book despite me not super remembering it. Personally, I really actually liked the narrator of it, so it wasn't like her narration made me not able to concentrate on it. It wasn't that at all. I think it was just everything going on in my own brain, but you can still definitely tell that the author put in a ton of research for this book, and I definitely did learn some stuff from it, like the living conditions back then. I had no idea that was what was going on, and it is incredibly depressing to read, which you would think kind of goes without saying when it comes to true crime books, because obviously they are depressing with their subject matter. But with other true crime books that I've read, they have these moments of not happiness, but like hopefulness, I guess you would say, where you get to see usually like the families of the victims either like really fighting to try to find their loved one or fighting for justice for their loved one. You usually get to see the abductor, the murderer, whoever put behind bars, whereas none of that stuff happens in this book. Like, it's just sad from beginning to end. Like, they did not lead very happy lives, and a lot of them did have families, but their families weren't there for them in these times. And then obviously Jack the Ripper was never caught or identified, and he's probably one of the more romanticized serial killers, as disturbing as that is. So all across the board, this was just a very depressing book to read, and I think I just read it at a time that wasn't a good time for me to read this kind of book, if that makes sense. So even though I don't super remember it, I do remember in the moment just recognizing the fact that the author clearly put in a lot of research to write this book. So I would still totally recommend it, and I do have the intention of some point picking this book back up in the future in its physical form and hopefully getting a lot more out of it and absorbing a bit more of the story. So those were my 2 3-star reads. Now moving on to my 4-star read, which is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I do believe that I am the last person on the planet to have read this book, but just in case you also have been living under a rock, I will tell you what this book is about. It is the first book in a YA fantasy series in which we're following our main character called Selena Sardathian, and she is like the best assassin out there, but before the events of this book take place, she is betrayed and captured, and she is imprisoned for a while until the prince actually comes to her with this proposition that she can compete in this game to be the king's assassin, and if she wins, she'll have to serve her time as the king's assassin for a couple years, but then after that she'll earn her freedom. And so she agrees to compete in this competition, but then her other competitors start to turn up murdered in some very gory ways, and that is more or less the synopsis of this book. So I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about this book going into it for a couple of reasons. One, it's an assassin story, which is not like the most interesting thing for me. Also, it's fantasy, which although fantasy used to be like my top read genre, I have very much drifted from the fantasy genre over the last few years. And also it's a part of a series, which these days I lose steam with series very quickly, which hopefully won't happen with this one, but it's a true fact. And also there's just a lot of hype surrounding this book. So I went into it kind of thinking I don't really think I'm going to like this book that much. But I'm happy to say that I actually really enjoyed it. I'm not gonna lie, it took me a good 100 to 150 pages to actually get into the story. It was a little bit difficult for me to get into that like fantasy headspace, but once I was there, I was totally into it, and there were so many aspects of the story that I really enjoyed. For one thing, the kind of darker tones to it, I guess maybe I just haven't read fantasy in a long time, but some of the gory descriptions of the way that the people are murdered was just not what I would usually expect from a YA book, and as a horror fan, I really appreciated the kind of darker, gorier imagery, and I almost feel like if this was a movie, it would borderline on something that would be fantasy horror. I almost just want to say something like Pan's Labyrinth, which that is obviously on like its own pedestal, but you know, something like that where it's like fantasy but it's much darker, but not like your typical kind of horror. That's how I feel this book would be if it was a movie, sort of. I don't know if that makes sense. I also really appreciated the fact that this book is told in the third person, and while we do mainly follow our main character Selena, at times you would get these paragraphs that would follow some of the other characters, such as the prince or the captain of the guard, who is another one of the like main characters in this book, or at times you would also get paragraphs following the more antagonist characters, which I don't feel like you get very often. Like, you would just every once in a while get this little glimpse into like the villain's side of the story, and I thought that that was really interesting. But I have to say, my favorite part about this book had to be the romance, which isn't even that prominent in this book. Like, I wouldn't even say that the romance is necessarily like a subplot of this book, because it really isn't. But the things, the romantic-y kind of things that happened in this book were just like things that I have dreamed about. Like, somehow this author pinpointed these certain things that have like lived in my mind for such a long time. So to give you an example, I should probably give you a little bit of context first. There's a little bit of a love triangle in this book, but it's so like not a prominent thing that I didn't really mind it that much. But you've got obviously Selena, and then you've got the captain of the guard, whose name I don't really know how to pronounce. I was pronouncing it Cole, but I don't think that's how it's supposed to be said, but for the sake of the video, we're gonna call him Cole. And then you have Prince Dorian. If you're wondering, I am currently on the side of Prince Dorian if we're doing the whole love triangle thing. So there are two specific things that the prince does in this book that, like I said, are things that I have just like dreamed about in my mind. So For one, there is a part during the beginning when Cole, or however you say his name, is giving Selena a tour around the castle where she's going to be staying, and they go into the library, and she loves to read books, so point for her character. Love a character that loves to read books. But she's told that she can't read the books in this library because they're only for the royal family, so the prince and the king and the queen. So she writes the prince a letter asking for her to be able to read the books in the library. And not only does he write her a letter back saying that she can, but he also specifically sends her a stack of books that he has enjoyed and wants her to read. And oh, my heart just swooned in that moment. And then a bit later on in the book, I hope nobody considers this to be a spoiler, but the prince may or may not gift her a puppy. Ooh, which is just everything I've ever wanted in a man. So needless to say, that whole element of the story, I was just blushing, my face is hot right now, and I just loved it. So I am super looking forward to reading the sequel just to see how the romance will develop. And I know that everybody else watching this probably knows how the romance does develop, and if she doesn't end up with the prince, I'm gonna be real disappointed. So we're just gonna stop talking about it now because I talked enough about that book, but those are my feelings, and as you could probably tell, I feel very strongly about them. So now moving on to my favorite book that I read in April, which I gave 4.5 stars, and that is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. Once again, I am one of the last people on the planet to have read from this author before. He is up there with your top thriller authors, and as a thriller fan, I do feel a bit like a fraud for not having read from him sooner, but I was also, like Throne of Glass, a bit apprehensive going into this book because of the amount of hype that surrounds it, because sometimes very hyped books can have this feeling of being a bit anticlimactic, so to say. So I was a little nervous going into this, but I can honestly say that I think this book deserves all of the hype that it gets. I loved this book. This is one of the best thrillers that I have read in a while, but also just in general, it's one of the best ones that I have read. Just in case you don't know what this book is about, I should probably give you a little bit of a synopsis. So in this book, we follow our main character called Jules, and at the beginning of this book, she is more or less going for a job interview to be an apartment sitter at this apartment building in Manhattan that is for the rich and famous. Only the very elite live at this apartment building, and it's kind of a very secretive place. It has a bit of a dark history to it, but because it's so fancy, they never want any of their apartments to be empty, so they hire these apartment sitters, more or less, in between people coming to permanently live there. So she ends up being hired as one of the apartment sitters for the very top apartment, the most expensive penthouse in the apartment building, and she ends up meeting another apartment sitter that is sitting in the apartment right below her, and then the very next day that apartment sitter goes missing without a trace, and so that leads Jules to kind of start to investigate some of the apartment building's dark history. And that's all that I really want to tell you about the plot, because as you guys know, I do recommend just going into thrillers blind, which is basically what I did with this book. I had a very vague understanding of what it was about, but not really at all, and the twist in this book totally did not see coming, and it was really good. I always, whenever I really like a book, I can't formulate thoughts to give you about why I liked the book, but just know that I really liked it. I will say it is an extremely atmospheric book, which just personally for me is something that I super appreciate. I love atmosphere. I especially liked, which you might not understand unless you've read the book, but there was this use of imagery with wallpaper, where some people will look at the wallpaper and see something, and some people will look at the wallpaper and will see something else, and I thought that whole idea and that imagery was so interesting. Also, this book had some of the best edge of my seat moments that I have ever read, and it was definitely a personal preference thing. So to give you context, when I was a child, I was very much the kid that nobody ever wanted to hide with when we would play hide and seek, because the idea of hiding and somebody looking for me and sneaking around, for some reason it really freaked me out. So I was the kid that would have to hide with covering my mouth, and I would be struggling to not make make noise, and I would be like so like jittery because for some reason that idea of like somebody coming to look for me and like me having to sneak around really freaked me out. So there are so many moments in this book where our main character has to like sneak around and like hide, and those moments just had me on the edge of my seat, which, like I said, is just like a personal thing for me. If you didn't have the same issue as a child, then you probably won't feel the same way about those scenes. But personally, this was just one of the best thriller books that I have ever read, and I would 100% recommend it. I feel like it was definitely worth all of the hype, and I'm super excited to pick up other books by this author. So hopefully I explained my thoughts well for this book, and you will pick it up for yourself if you haven't already. But also, like I said, sometimes with my very favorite books, I find it very difficult to explain just how much I enjoyed them. But yeah, those are the 4 books that I read in April. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I'd love to discuss them with you in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!